Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methven, and tonight I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Helena, how are things going with you?
I'm doing very, very well, Stephen. Always happy to be sharing the show with you tonight. And I would like to say I love the shirt.
Thank you very much. I'm a big fan of birds. Coming up on tonight's show, Starmer's new pledges, or are they even that new, and the murder of a health insurance CEO in the US. Stay tuned for all of that. But to start with, we have a very, very big story. We're going to be discussing Amnesty International's comprehensive new report on the genocide in Gaza. We're going to be doing a fairly deep dive. Amnesty International has formally accused Israel of committing genocide. Entitled, "You Feel Like You Are Subhuman, Israel's Genocide Against Palestinians in Gaza," Amnesty's report is 296 pages long. Speaking to Al Jazeera, Amnesty head Agnes Kalamard summarized the organization's findings.
We looked at the statement made by officials at the highest level, those in the war cabinet. We looked at how soldiers interpreted those statements, those on the ground, and how they called as well for the dehumanization of Palestinians and for the obliteration of Gaza. We looked at the entire context as well, one of apartheid, dispossession, military occupation, and the only reasonable conclusion we could make is that Israel intended to commit genocide.
Now, in the report, Amnesty makes a forensic case for applying the legal concept of genocide. So not just the everyday concept, the one that's enshrined in international law, to Israel's actions in Gaza. So why is that so important? Well, if you remember, the International Court of Justice found in January that there was a plausible risk that Israel was committing a genocide against Palestinians, and it imposed provisional measures on Israel, preventing them from carrying one out. Despite those measures being internationally binding, the court's orders were ignored and remain unenforced. But the ICJ also said it didn't have the evidence to judge whether Israel was in fact committing genocide. Nearly a year on, Amnesty has amassed and analysed 212 witness testimonies from Palestinians, 102 statements from senior Israeli officials, satellite imagery, video footage, and photographs. And they find what we've all known all along. Against the same legal criteria used by the ICJ and every single government signed up to the Genocide Convention, Israel has committed and continues to commit genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Helena, before we get into the details of the report, and it's a fairly dense report, so we won't be able to go through everything, but we're going to hit the high spots. What, in your mind, is its significance?
I mean, you talk about previously how there's a kind of a colloquial understanding of what's happening in Gaza as being a genocide, right? And I think that's been the way it's been described more broadly because of not just the intentions, but the things that we see, the visceral images that come through to us when we view what's happening in Gaza every day. But of course, this is something, as you say, very different, talking specifically about the legal case for genocide and compiling all the evidence necessary. Now, we've seen loads of different bits and pieces of sporadic evidence here and there. There have been individual groups, independent groups who've done forensic analysis. They have done loads of collations of all of the different statements made by Israeli ministers and high-ups in the IDF. The genocidal statements, for example, that were presented in South Africa's case, the ICJ. There are loads of different bits and pieces that you have to piece together a case, or to piece together the things that you would need to see the genocidal intentions of Israel and the IDF in Gaza already, but without having the step-by-step breakdown exactly with everything being corroborated and cross-referenced from as many different sources as possible rather than just here and there. And the second most important thing about this is who it's coming from. It's coming from Amnesty International. It's not just coming from an independent group. This gives it far more perceived legitimacy if it's coming from someone who has a group that is internationally known for being champions of human rights and the plight of everybody who goes through similar things to what the Palestinians have been through since their founding as Amnesty International. And that is a lot of weight that you previously wouldn't have gotten. You can't really apply a geopolitical intent like you could for the South Africa's case at the ICJ, which some people have tried to do. This is far more dispassionate and, again, incredibly rigorous, as I'm sure we are about to see in our coverage. The only thing I would say is that what you're likely to see a lot of in the wake of this report coming out and the accusation being made by Amnesty against the state of Israel is a lot of people instantly saying, well, actually, you can't trust Amnesty International. The human rights industry is innately anti-Semitic. I've seen people genuinely say this. We need to be like when they call it the United Nations, whether it's Save the Children or whether it's Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International will no doubt get tarred with a very similar brush. And we've already seen liberals say, well, I wouldn't trust anything Amnesty International said, because again, they're going to have to say things like this to ensure that they feel better by not having to face up to the fact that the governments that they potentially have voted for and support have been complicit in what we have seen carried out in Gaza since October the 7th.
Quite right. We're also likely to see Amnesty, attempts to discredit Amnesty in the way that there were also attempts to first discredit the International Court of Justice and then to discredit the International Criminal Court and its prosecutor. But let's get into that report now. So there are two components to international law when it comes to rulings on genocide. The first is that the perpetrator must have committed specific prohibited acts. Amnesty considers three. 1, killing members of the group. 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And 3, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Now, to establish the first two of those, Amnesty looked at 15 Israeli airstrikes that took place between the 7th of October 2023 and the 20th of April 2024. These include an attack on a market in Jabalia refugee camp in northern Gaza on October 9th last year that killed at least 70 civilians, including 15 children. There was also the attack on the St. Porphyrius Church on 19th of October, in which 18 civilians were killed. And then there was the December bombing of a family home in Rafah that killed 22 civilians, including 11 children. In all of the 15 cases that Amnesty considered, in which a total of at least 334 civilians were killed, including 141 children, the organization could find, quote, no evidence of a military objective. Now, obviously, that is against the idea that what Israel is doing is striking at Hamas militants. So in those 15 cases that they've studied, there's no sign of a military objective. Amnesty also found that in 14 out of 15 of those strikes, Palestinian civilians were given no warning of an impending attack. Now, obviously, we know there have been many, many more cases of indiscriminate Israeli bombing targeting civilian life. But these were the cases where Amnesty was able to compile physical and photographic evidence as well as witness statements. In many cases, there are, of course, no witnesses left, with evidence also destroyed by constant bombing and the massive movement of over 2 million people across the Strip. Now, the report includes that Amnesty did try to investigate many other cases, but it says this. By 30th of June 2024, Amnesty International had conducted preliminary fieldwork into 124 other airstrikes across Gaza. For 52 of them, it had also completed extensive desk research. Amnesty International was not able to pursue additional research into those cases or establish conclusive evidence as to their lawfulness for several reasons, including the safety of its field workers, the high number of internally displaced people present who are unknown to local residents, the inability to re-establish contact with survivors of the attacks or to conduct follow-up visits to the strike locations, and Israel's continued denial of Amnesty International staff, and indeed any other human rights investigators, access to Gaza. However, in all of the cases, the organization established that Israel carried out of the attacks. In many of them, it found no legitimate military target. Now, all 15 cases were submitted by Amnesty to the Israeli Ministry of Defense at least twice between last October and this October, and they've received no response. But Amnesty's case studies, combined with the work of other NGOs and journalists, led them to this conclusion. Viewed in isolation, some of the attacks analysed and the resultant high civilian death toll may be attributed to recklessness or negligence on the part of the Israeli military. However, viewed together and cumulatively over the course of 9 months, when committed by one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world, Israel's repetition of such deadly attacks, many on homes and other buildings in densely populated civilian neighborhoods, indicates intentional and deliberate direct attacks on civilians or equally intentional and deliberately indiscriminate attacks. These acts were specifically committed against Palestinians in Gaza, who are a substantial part of a protected group under the Genocide Convention. Now, the third prohibited act that Amnesty considered was deliberately inflicting on Palestinians conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the Palestinian people in whole or in part. Those were just 3 examples of some of the heavy explosive weapons Israel has used on Gaza over the past, more than a year now. One of the most densely populated areas in the world. As the Amnesty report points out, just 3 days into Israel's assault on the enclave, the country's military admitted by 10th of October 2023 to dropping thousands of tons of munitions on the Strip. But for the injured and dying, there were fewer and fewer places to go as hospitals became unsafe places. According to the report, doctors providing care to patients in Gaza described multiple factors affecting the ability of hospitals to function, including severely lacking supplies, evacuation orders that forced the hospitals to close, and hospitals staff to abandon supplies. There was also looting of supplies and equipment after evacuation orders, killings of medical staff, and raids and other attacks on hospitals that damaged the facility itself or equipment within it, or led to the killing, injury, detention, or enforced disappearance of hospital staff. Amnesty also details wave after wave of mass forced displacement. According to Amnesty, Israel repeatedly issued evacuation orders in the full knowledge that people could not seek safety by leaving the territory. The Israeli authorities also banned Palestinians from exiting Gaza via Israel. They cancelled all exit permits that had previously allowed a tiny proportion of Gaza's Palestinian population to cross into Israel for daily labor, trade, medical care, or humanitarian work. And they did so knowing that there was nowhere safe in Gaza. Now, the report also looks at Israel's restrictions on aid, the spread of starvation-level hunger and contagious disease throughout the Strip, and the particular impact of the conditions that Israel has created on women and very small children. In April of this year, more than 6 months ago, one nutrition expert told Amnesty this about Gaza's children. They are standing at death's door. Their bodies are not ready to deal with it if anything hits them, and we don't have systems in place to provide them the medical aid they need. So if things do not drastically change, we will have the vanishing of this young generation. These children will be gone. Now, that does seem aimed at destroying in whole or part the Palestinian people. Helena, one of the things that struck me in the report, especially when it was talking about the 15 cases of airstrikes on civilians, was the real difficulty of collecting evidence and witness testimonies. I mean, there are particular difficulties when it comes to Gaza because Israel won't let outsiders in. And so I suppose you're using people who are already in the territory. But of course, it's always the case with genocide that the criminals, the ones committing the genocide, do whatever it takes to conceal any evidence of it. What did you make of that first part of the report that deals with the prohibited actions that Israel has taken in Gaza?
I mean, a lot of it is very damning, although, to be fair, a lot of this is stuff, again, that essentially by osmosis, we have already seen, we've already had plenty of instances of. But what was necessary was to collate a lot of these things in one place, establish precedent, be able to take loads of different actions over a long period of time, and be able to bring them together to find a coherent case that indicates that these things are systemic and these things are happening repetitively and deliberately. So this is something that's really important out of what we have seen so far. But you're right. It is interesting, obviously terrifying, just how much difficult it is to be able to create an entire picture of everything that's happened from October the 7th until today, because of the lack of information on the ground. Again, journalists not being allowed in, or if they are allowed in, they're only allowed to see what the IDF allows them to do so. And what we have from citizen journalists on the ground is still, of course, particularly patchy in terms of what we find from Palestinian journalists. Palestinian citizen journalists can only show us what's in their very small vicinity. We don't really have much coverage over huge swathes of the area, especially, for example, in northern Gaza, where we have seen the ethnic cleansing campaign of the last few months to be able to completely empty it of Palestinians, presumably so that Smotrich can carry out the settlement plan that he so wants to carry out in northern Gaza. And of course, what citizen journalists that there are on the ground in Gaza, which obviously are not under the control of the IDF, a lot of these people end up being killed by Israel. Again, this has become one of the deadliest conflicts for journalists specifically that we've seen in decades, in a very, very long time. So the fact that Amnesty have been able to piece together such a comprehensive and coherent case towards each of the different parts of the genocide definitions that they are trying to gather that information for really does credit to show just how thorough Amnesty have been in pouring through all of the different pieces of evidence that they have managed to get hold of in this case. And it's damning. It's very, very damning in terms of putting into practice the kind of things that we heard from Israeli ministers at the start of the conflict, what gave us the warning. Of course, there are obviously plenty of warnings in terms of how Israel have treated the Palestinians up until now, but at the start of the conflict, many of the statements that signaled the intentions of the Israeli state in what their campaign would be in Gaza were said very, very plainly. And all of us here over on the pro-Palestinian side of this discussion, we instantly heard what was said and knew what was to come. And lots of people try to undermine that and say, well, this is context here, but if you look at this in a different way, then, well, they could be meaning this. Well, turns out they meant what they said. When someone like Ari Dichter said, we are rolling out the Gaza Nakba, they meant it. And that is what we have again.
Now, I noticed in the chat earlier, some people were saying, look, what is the point of this? Because it's not going to stop the genocide. And, unfortunately, that's true. Only the international community can sanction Israel and stop them from continuing with their genocidal actions in Gaza. And in fact, it's not even the international community. It's the US and its allies that are able to do that. And of course, they're not. But I think something that you mentioned there, Helena, about the killing of journalists in Gaza makes at least one thing about this report really important, which is that a year and a month, or nearly 2 months now, into this assault, someone has done the work of recording in fairly fine-grained detail as much as they can of where things are now. If it goes on for another year, that evidence, the evidence that forms the basis of those records may indeed be lost. So when it does eventually come to what will hopefully be a criminal prosecution of Israel in the International Criminal Court of Justice for genocide, so where the court actually at that point looks backwards on what's happened, it's able to use that kind of evidential basis to find Israel guilty. Of course, the people in the chat who were rightly upset at the fact that this doesn't stop the genocide, they're completely right. The way to stop the genocide is to keep protesting, keep putting pressure on your government to make them act. But in the meantime, recording it so that history records what has happened in Gaza, and so that the court later, hopefully, records what has happened in Gaza is vitally important. Now, perhaps the hardest part of proving that a state is committing genocide is establishing intent. I mean, that's always the hardest part of any kind of criminal trial. It has to be shown that the state, in this case Israel, committed the prohibited acts we've already described with, quote, the intent to destroy in whole or in part the group as such. And the group there is, of course, the Palestinians. But in many ways, Israeli officials and soldiers have actually made this part rather easy. After all, senior politicians haven't been shy. This was Israel's President Isaac Herzog on 12th of October last year, responding to a question about how Israel would keep civilians safe. He said this: "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It is absolutely not true." Now, after that press conference, Herzog was asked whether he thought that made people in Gaza legitimate targets, civilians legitimate targets. And he was very, very careful to roll back at that point and say, no, of course not. But you're speaking with two sides of your face when you say there is nobody innocent, and yet not everybody is a target. And I'm going to come to a moment to this idea of like what constitutes evidence of intent. But here's another example from the report. This was Israel Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir's take in November last year. He said, "To be clear, when they say that Hamas needs to be eliminated, it also means those who sing, those who support, and those who distribute sweets. All of these are terrorists, and they should be eliminated." Both these statements, along with 20 others by senior Israeli officials, are included in Amnesty's report. The report also demonstrates that these statements by senior officials had material effects. Amnesty's examination of 62 videos, audio recordings, and photographs suggests this genocidal language trickled down to the actions and rhetoric of Israeli soldiers in Gaza. Actions and rhetoric like this.
There has been a remarkable number of videos posted by Israeli soldiers on social media depicting themselves pillaging property, mocking the death and destruction that they are causing, and most egregiously torturing, humiliating, and mocking detained Palestinian prisoners. There have been many images of Israeli soldiers who've ransacked Palestinian homes and confiscated their personal goods. One in particular is the red negligee that appears to be seen in so many Israeli videos where Israeli soldiers are mocking and advertising their very deliberate intrusion of the home of a Palestinian woman, the confiscation of her most intimate apparel, and flaunting that in a way that's definitely intended to be provocative and humiliating. There's such a high level of confidence among these IDF soldiers that they can do whatever they want. To say to the whole world, look at what we're doing to Palestinians in Gaza, look at how we are brutalizing detainees, look at how we're humiliating every single man, woman, and child as we destroy their homes, set fire to them, and make fun of it. And they are provoking and challenging the whole world to say, we can do this, we can get away with it, and no one in the world can stop us.
On the matter of Israel's genocidal intentions, the report concludes with this: "A combined reading of Israeli officials' and soldiers' statements and rhetoric, which accompanied Israel's military operations in Gaza following 7th of October 2023, points to the existence of an intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as such." And just to say the as such there, to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as such, is to destroy them as Palestinians, not as combatants, not as anything else, but as Palestinians. And the report goes on to say this: "The evidence presented in the report clearly shows that the destruction of the Palestinians in Gaza as such was Israel's intent, either in addition to or as a means to achieve its military aims. There is only one reasonable inference that can be drawn from the evidence presented. Genocidal intent has been part and parcel of Israel's conduct in Gaza since the 7th of October 2023, including its military campaign." Helena, I said at the top, intent is always hard to prove, and some online that I've seen today responding to this report seem to think that what you need is a smoking gun. You need like a printed out dossier of like all the steps in which you're going to eradicate a people, or some kind of document. That's clearly not the evidential standard that Amnesty International is taking. It also didn't seem to be the evidential standard that the ICJ was taking. But do you think that evidential standard is too high? Or do you think that what Amnesty is providing is enough to at least imply, as they say, that there was genocidal intent right from the beginning?
I think the intention, like the implication that there is intention there, is very strong in the statements that we've heard. There's been long lists of these. That is only a very small amount of the statements that have been made that show the intent to do the things that have been done in Gaza. up until this point. So the implication is clearly there, but the difficulty is that when it comes to the legal crime of genocide on the international stage, evidentiary support has to be very high in lots of different instances. So, for example, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to quote a couple of bits and pieces from an excellent video by a channel called Bad Empanada talking about the difficulty in proving genocide in terms of, for example, in Bosnia. So most people will think of Bosnia as being a genocide in Bosnia as a country, when in the actual case that was brought against the Serbs, it was only specifically Srebrenica that counted as a genocidal act within the entire conflict. This was despite the fact that in many instances in East Bosnia, there were plenty of instances, as I say, of the military deliberately ethnically cleansing and exterminating people explicitly on grounds of them being Bosnians to try and create a Serb-only a republic in eastern Bosnia that could then be annexed by Serbia proper. And even all of these instances that we'd seen, for example, the mass killings and the ethnic cleansing in all of these different areas, that still, when the judgment was made, wasn't enough to constitute a genocide in Bosnia proper outside of very specifically Srebrenica. So the standard that we have here, even though we have on record from the Serbian parliament, Ratko Mladic, explicitly saying, well, we need to ensure that we don't get charged with these kind of crimes after these things are committed. So this is the way that we can do it so that we don't. That still wasn't enough to do it to say so outside of that very specific instance. There's also a geopolitical pressure not to be able to make that case either, as it was actually very, very late until the conflict that Western forces decided to stop a genocide. You've got to remember, under the Genocide Convention, you actually have people who are party to it have a duty to stop it if they think that it is occurring. And there was plenty of, people in the West who didn't like the idea of there being a Muslim nation inside Europe, who were very, very happy to turn a blind eye to the things that were happening. And it was only until it became undeniable that there was intervention. So there is plenty of pressure on international groups to not actually label these things as genocide. And the level to which that you have to get all of the smoking guns, as you say, is actually incredibly high, so much so that there are plenty of other things that we would colloquially call genocides that haven't been labeled as such outside of a very small number of cases. So when it comes to how we want to think about it in terms of the way we discuss it colloquially, I think we've seen plenty of evidence already, and we don't need the smoking gun. But when it actually comes to the legal definition, whether or not this becomes legally considered a genocide and however many years it will take to be able to legally kind of bring this about, at the end of the day, we've all seen the war crimes. They are being Netanyahu and Gallant have been charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes. We've seen in detail the kind of things that the ICC want to charge these people specifically for. And whether or not you name these things genocide or not, that doesn't change the fact that the widespread condemnation is required for what has happened in Gaza up until this point. So whether or not we need the smoking gun, as you say, or whether or not the statements that we have heard is enough to be able to show people intent, as far as I'm concerned, it's all by the by. Because we have seen the carnage, we have seen what's happened ourselves, and we obviously have used that to try and force politically as much as we can an end to all of the violence that we've seen. And that, quite frankly, is what's important here, whether or not we term it genocide or ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity or atrocities. The naming convention, that is not relevant to me as per how we stop it, the condemnation, and whether or not there are repercussions for the people who've committed these atrocities.
Look, I completely agree with you about people on the ground, us, that it doesn't really matter whether it's a genocide or whether it's a war crime or whether it's ethnic cleansing. It's just a huge violation of the dignity of humanity and the preciousness of humanity en masse that's happening in Gaza at the moment. But I think it does matter politically in a different kind of way, in the sense that, the notion of a genocide has massive ramifications as a concept, but also being implicated in a genocide, in giving it cover, in giving it weapons, in arming it, as the US has done, as the UK has done. Having Israel eventually found guilty of genocide is the sort of thing that would involve really the tarnishing historically of the reputations of those countries that have aided and abetted it. But of course, there's all the more reason that it will never happen, right? Because those countries are not going to want to find themselves anywhere near the word genocide, and so they'll keep Israel away from that word as well. So what has Israel said about Amnesty's comprehensive study of its genocide? Well, they've denied it. The spokesperson for Israel's foreign ministry said this: "The deplorable and fanatical organization Amnesty International has once again produced a fabricated report that is entirely false and based on lies. The genocide or massacre on October the 7th, 2023 was carried out by the Hamas terrorist organization against Israeli citizens. Since then, Israeli citizens have been subjected to daily attacks from 7 different fronts. Israel is defending itself against these attacks, acting fully in accordance with international law." So that's the standard Israeli line, government line. And the Israeli government is, of course, very happy to use the word genocidal itself, but deprive other people of using it to describe their conditions. And yeah, that line is that all of this carnage and destruction is actually defense. We were only defending ourselves from the 3,100 children under 5 that we've killed in Gaza so far. After just 5 months in office, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has revealed a new plan for the government. Labour have been very clear that this is not a reset. It's not a reset, but you have to admit it looks a lot like one. Here's Starmer speaking from Pinewood Studios today.
To drive those missions forward in this Parliament and show our progress towards them, today we publish new milestones, measurable milestones, that will also give the British people the power to hold our feet to the fire. Because that accountability, that is part of how we shift the focus in Westminster towards long-term change. Second, our plan commits Whitehall to mission-led government, an approach to governing that won't just deliver change, but also change the nature of governing itself, fix the foundations and find new tools for the job. Make no mistake, this plan will land on desks across Whitehall with the heavy thud of a gauntlet being thrown down.
The heavy thud of a gauntlet being thrown down. He's not messing around, you guys. Between the missions and the milestones, the cornerstones and the foundation stones, it can be hard to see the wood for the trees. But here are the government's 6 new milestone pledges. Number 1, NHS, 92% of routine operations and appointments within 18 weeks of referral. Next, living standards, raising real terms disposable household income. Crime, putting 13,000 more officers on the beat. House building, building 1.5 million new homes. Net zero, decarbonising the energy grid by 2030. Education, 75% of children being school ready by reception. Now look, those are some quite hefty and difficult targets, particularly the pledge to cut NHS waiting times to 18 weeks. That's something that hasn't been a reality for just about 10 years. And it's interesting to see Labour shifting focus from the interminable chatter about growth. Instead, the focus now seems to be moving on to how well off people feel in terms of the money they have to spend, rather than overall GDP growth, which feels like quite an abstract concept and, it's not really felt by people. And maybe that's because Starmer's government hasn't exactly enjoyed a stellar first 5 months in office. The first Labour government in 15 years has been plagued by a row over gifts and freebies and angered both pensioners and farmers with its decisions around winter fuel payment and inheritance tax. But more broadly, Labour were elected on a mandate to deliver change. But public optimism isn't exactly popping. That mood is reflected in Starmer's approval ratings. At the end of November, the Prime Minister's personal approving rating stood at minus 25%, according to polling agency Opinion. And at the end of October, his rating hit its lowest point, again according to Opinion, of minus 32%. So how is the government going to achieve its 6 milestone pledges? Here's Starmer again.
It begins, as we set out in our manifesto, with strong foundations: economic stability, national security, border security. Those fundamentals never change, and we will never risk them. That's the argument we made and continue to make about the values of a changed Labour Party, serving the real concerns of working people, not changing the conversation, not walking away or talking down to them. And that's not just about immigration, but as ever, that shows the argument. Take these statistics that were published last week, which revealed with total clarity how the Tories lost control of immigration, opened the borders deliberately to cover up the extent of their economic stagnation. Zero regard for the damage to trust in politics. Absolutely unforgivable. Now, this government will reduce immigration, legal and illegal, because that is what working people want.
Now, that was a promise of a reduction to the numbers of people immigrating into the UK, but Starmer was very reluctant to put any figure on it. And there is really some politicization going on here. I'm not saying that I'm not saying immigration figures aren't too high, legal immigration figures, but I am saying, and Starmer knows this very well, that the ONS, Migrant Observatory, very many other organizations have said, look, it's a blip. It's a post-COVID blip. It's also connected with Brexit and the decline in migration from the EU and an uptick in migration from outside of the EU. They all project that immigration figures are going to fall to much, much lower levels over the next 3 or 4 years. So he is just politicizing those very impressive figures that were published last week. You can't deny that they were big figures. He's politicizing it in the context of also knowing that that's not going to last. In his speech, Starmer then turned his sights on civil servants and the public sector. He even borrowed a phrase from President-elect Donald Trump, perhaps tapping into a perceived mood of hostility towards bureaucracy.
I don't think there's a swamp to be drained here. But I do think that too many people in Whitehall are comfortable in the tepid bath of managed decline, have forgotten, to paraphrase JFK, that you choose change not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Change and reform are coming. That's what this plan means. Productivity in the public sector is 2.6% lower than this time last year, 8.5% down compared with just before the pandemic. Now, that would not be accepted in any other sector or walk of life. And I'm not going to subsidise it with ever-rising taxes on the British people.
And that's the thanks our hardworking nurses, doctors, teachers, other members of the public sector get. It's because of your low productivity that I haven't been able to make the changes I promised. And it wasn't only public sector workers who were to blame for Starmer's slow progress. A key part of Starmer's speech dealt with England and Wales's planning system, which, according to Keir, has us all in a chokehold, and not in a good way.
You walk around our country, you look at our infrastructure, and it is clear almost immediately that we have long freeloaded off the British genius of the past because we won't build a future. We haven't built a reservoir for over 30 years. And even the projects we do approve are fought tooth and nail and tooth until you end up with the absurd spectacle of a £100 million bat tunnel holding up the country's single biggest infrastructure project, driving up taxes and the cost of living beyond belief. And I tell you now, this government will not accept this nonsense anymore. We will streamline the approval process in the forthcoming planning and infrastructure bill. And driving through reform, I can announce another new target. Not just 1.5 million homes, but also 150 major infrastructure projects. A milestone that will triple the number of decisions on national infrastructure compared with the last Parliament. And just as importantly, will send a very clear message to the NIMBYs, the regulators, the blockers, the bureaucrats, the alliance of naysayers, The people who say, no, Britain can't do this. We can't get things done in our country. Well, we say to them, you no longer have the upper hand. Britain says yes.
Yeah, lines of naysayers. Britain says yes, but yes to what, Keir? Starmer's speech garnered a less than enthusiastic reaction from one small business owner in Hertfordshire. This is what she told Sky News.
Do you have a kind of clear idea of what's making the Prime Minister and the government tick? Like what sort of story they're trying to tell, what message they're trying to push out there?
Well, I presume, and I'm assuming, which you should never do, but I think they want the more business owners to contribute more. But when you're small and you're just a small independent, you're just like literally struggling from one day to the next. So you don't need these added bonuses. If anything, it would be nice if they attack the online businesses, you know, the Amazons of this world, the, you know, ASOS, etc. I have a shop, so I have all the outgoings of a shop. They don't have that. I'm not sure why he's done this today. I have no idea, other than his popularity is so low.
So that's a small business owner in the home counties with a more radical idea for taxing big business than the Labour government. Helena, Starmer's problem is people are not feeling more money in their pocket. They're still feeling the cost of living crisis, even though he promised change from the get-go. You know, starting gun goes off for a new government, change. So what's the strategy here? You know, we've got milestones and cornerstones and foundation stones and missions galore. It seems like barely a week goes by without Keir Starmer launching something, anything to make it sound like something's happening. Is he just, you know, yet another prime minister whose media strategy is dominating or outpacing his policy strategy? And is he doing a good job even in terms of a media strategy?
I mean, it doesn't seem to be working very well at all, does it? You know, no matter how many relaunches he does, are we on like relaunch 5 or 6 at this point? It doesn't seem to help change people's perception of him. Now, what you say, they were coming in saying we have a mandate for change. Well, you weren't really offering that much change. Centrist tinkering around the edges, but there's a really great bit that James Schneider said on Cross Question on LBC, which is if they don't come up with something fast to make a really large difference to this country, he's going to be the most hated man in Britain. And it looks like that's been a very prescient prediction from James about what's going to happen if Keir Starmer doesn't get his act together. And instead of getting up on his podium and posturing and postulating about the things that they might be able to do in government, actually getting down to brass tacks and doing things is going to be a really difficult and long 5 years for them. One of the biggest issues that they have is that they have this kind of obsession because they've been trying to do this change Labour Party thing where they appeal to not just median voters, but a very specific type of kind of middle-class aspirational swing voter. They think that for the rest of the voting public, they'll just accept this kind of sensible adults in the room politics essentially being done paint by numbers, where you just make 10 pledges or 3 shifts or 6 first steps or 5 missions or 6 milestones. That's how many different categories of things that he's done with regards to a policy platform, loads of which, of course, he's broken. And then, first of all, trying to sell that to people as anything other than managerialism when they don't want that. And then second, of course, you know, loads of these things are now just broken. He opines about, you know, trust in politics being broken by the Conservative Party not hitting their promises on immigration. And don't get me wrong, that is a democratic deficit, even if I disagree with the policy platform of getting immigration down, because I don't think that we should. It is a democratic deficit. People voted for it and they didn't get it. But for him to then criticize somebody else for making promises and then not cashing that check, it makes it seem incredibly hypocritical, and it doesn't come across to the public. This is a man who's a real charisma vacuum, and this is going to only be done by showing real delivery. And it looks like, and we're not going to see very much of that given the small scope of the policy that's being offered. I mean, the planning stuff seems good, but it's not radical to the extent that we need to really turn around the fortunes of this country. There's one interesting thing, though, which I think they are getting right, by shifting the mission from being just about growth, right? This kind of nebulous concept of having high growth, line go up equals world more gooder. They've shifted their strategy to appealing to people's actual material conditions. Now, what this is them taking a leaf out of the problems that happened with the American election, where you had commentators on the liberal end banging on and on and on about, we've got the best COVID recovery in the G7, we've got the quickest removal of inflation, we have all of this expansionary policy that's great economic growth, we've got bottom quartile wages rising. And this was all true. This was all true facts about the state of the economy from 2022, from the Inflation Reduction Act until the election this year. But none of this posturing actually filtered down to favourable political coverage amongst people who are actually living their lives. The cost of living crisis in America hit people on the lowest incomes incredibly hard, because that's where inflation was at its it was at its peak, right? In the cheap household items and groceries and petrol prices were the ones that increased the most out of the things in the basket of goods that would create inflation, or that is used to measure inflation. And by not speaking to those concerns about actual people's living standards rather than generic economics numbers that people don't really engage with, that cost the Democrats the election. So I can understand why Labour have changed this focus towards people's perceptions of their living standards rather than just, are we making the economy grow? What is interesting, though, what a funny phrase that he said, change and reform are coming. Well, I don't see change coming very much, but you know what is coming? Reform are coming. They're coming in second place. There was a poll today by Find Out Now, well, Fuck Around and Found Out Now, probably better call them at this point, which showed the Labour Party in third. Polling in third in the quote-unquote honeymoon period. And it shows that actually, there isn't appetite for this managerial centrism. There isn't. People are looking for visionaries. Everything seems to be falling apart in this country. There doesn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel. And people are sick to death of politics by numbers, and they want a visionary. Keir Starmer isn't that. And unless he becomes that, or finds some way to ensure that there is somebody else who can take over who can do that, the visionary that we're going to get is going to be Nigel Farage, and it doesn't look like to me he has a vision worth pursuing.
I think there is actually a genuine problem with asking people to, how wealthy they feel, to look at their own pockets rather than to look at the economy. And that's, I think, an issue that struck in the American election as well, which is that, people look at the prices of things on shelves and they don't see them going down. They don't necessarily, look at how much is left in their pockets after doing their groceries if their wages are going up. What they're looking at is the idea that, I went to the pub last night and our producer Faye bought me a glass of wine and it was £7. And it's that's burned into my mind that a pint is now £7, that a glass of wine is £7, that, eggs are £3. That doesn't change. That's, and if you ask people to look at their spending and how wealthy they feel, those are the things they look at. And nothing that Starmer is doing, focusing on growth, so on and so forth, is bringing down those kinds of prices. So yeah, I think actually it is better sometimes to focus on abstract concepts than it is to ask people to look at their own financial affairs, unless you're really, really, really sure that when they look at those financial affairs, they're going to find a rosier picture than they did before you got into power. Now, speaking of rosy pictures, before we go on to our next story, a reminder that we, Novara Media, are currently running a fundraiser. So please have a look at this.
2024 saw a lot from decisive election results on both sides of the Atlantic.
Look what happened. Is this crazy?
To an ongoing genocide in Gaza and an emerging radical right.
So I'm coming back.
In both politics and culture.
We've seen the lengths the establishment is prepared to go to control the narrative.
Do you condemn
Condemn
what Hamas
did on October the 7th.
But thanks to our supporters, we've helped to correct the record.
Journalists don't understand that they're part of a propaganda system.
The level of bias hasn't changed.
What I pick up all the time is the frustration of voices not heard.
The media doesn't just need to be top-down, where billionaires either decide the truth or ignore it.
Novara Media exists because of our supporters.
We are truly people-powered because the average supporter gives us £8 a month.
This allows us to cover stories across video,
I'm not talking to you, clear up.
articles, and podcasts in a truly unique way.
Thank you to Novara Media for existing.
We've given a platform to the voices hit hardest by brutal policies.
Well, with all the shops being closed down.
The people and the communities the mainstream media ignores.
I am struggling, really struggling.
And the powerful try to silence.
We've broken stories into the mainstream.
I'm not aware of these allegations, but they sound very concerning.
Followed election campaign.
Beautiful Gattleming.
And covered election nights both in the UK and elsewhere.
Up and down, left and right. MAGA!
At Novara Media, we are up against powerful vested interests.
But with your support, we'll continue to tackle it head-on in ways you just won't find anywhere else.
And people-powered media needs people to power it.
That's why we're asking for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage per month.
Because a different kind of politics needs a different kind of media.
Donate today at novaramedia.com/support.
We're ready. Are you?
Go on, help us out, please. We are looking to do so many great and new things next year, getting bigger all the time, more investigations, more video work, more in-depth reporting on Novara Live. We can only do it with your help. And to those of you who help us already, we're very, very grateful. Thank you. A manhunt for the person who shot a health insurance company CEO dead in New York is now in its second day.
It's just before 6:45 in the morning, the sun not yet up, United Healthcare's CEO arriving at Manhattan's Hilton Hotel. Behind him, a gunman emerges from between two cars and opens fire. We're not showing the moments after, but he fires at least 3 shots at close range. As Brian Thompson falls to the ground by the wall, the gun, with silencer attached, appears to jam. He then moves calmly across the road before disappearing out of view. All this is key evidence in a truly shocking targeted shooting. Brian Thompson was 50, married with 2 sons, and the head of the health insurance division of United Healthcare, where he had worked for nearly 21 years.
This is New York City Police Commissioner Jessica Tisch at a press conference yesterday.
A brazen, targeted attack. This does not appear to be a random act of violence. The victim was in New York City to speak at an investor conference. It appears the suspect was lying in wait for several minutes. And as the victim was walking to the conference hotel, the suspect approached from behind and fired several rounds, striking the victim at least once in the back and at least once in the right calf. Many people passed the suspect, but he appeared to wait for his intended target. The suspect fled, first on foot, then on an e-bike.
Now, New York law enforcement are saying that the shooter is likely proficient in the use of firearms, leading to speculation that this may have been a professional hit job. And another detail has emerged today.
Investigators say they found shell casings with writing on them, including the words deny, defend, and depose. They also say they found a cell phone, granola bar wrappers, and a water bottle they believe are linked to the shooter.
The victim, Brian Thompson, earned $10.2 million last year as the CEO of United Healthcare, a branch of United Health Group. United Health Group is the biggest health insurer in the United States and worth about $440 billion. Over the past year, United Healthcare reportedly had multiple senior executives under investigation by the Department of Justice due to accusations of fraud and insider trading. The Department of Justice also launched a probe into whether United Healthcare was running a monopoly. And Brian Thompson's wife, Paulette, said he had been receiving threats connected to his job. She told NBC News this. There had been some threats. Basically, I don't know, a lack of coverage? I don't know details. I just know that he said there were some people that had been threatening him. And a lack of coverage there means, I suppose, people who were disgruntled by the fact that they'd paid a lot for insurance and then it had failed to cover them when it came to their needing a medical procedure, even a life-saving one. Now, we don't know the motivation behind Thompson's killing, nor would we speculate. But what we can say is this. The reaction from Americans who actually have to use private health insurance, and indeed private health insurance from this company, has been less than sympathetic. Here's one example from X. So it's a quote tweet. The original tweet says, just a reminder that Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Health, who was just shot and killed in New York, was a human being with a family. So many of the comments on his murder are despicable. And Julia Marie says, he will be shown the same empathy he showed for others every single day. The mood on X was certainly not one of blanket solemnity or mourning. In fact, Thompson's death seems to have unlocked a level of rage around the United States private healthcare model, where insurance companies amass vast profits while around tens of thousands of Americans die each year as a direct result of not being able to afford health insurance. This post has been viewed nearly 800,000 times on X. It reads, "A photographer took pictures of people before and after she told them a health insurance CEO was killed." And so you've got people there on the one side, kind of smiling, people on the other side looking pretty delighted. Americans took to social media to share affecting personal stories of their experiences with United Healthcare. This is another post from X. "Today, I'm thinking about the time United Healthcare suddenly decided to stop paying for my chemotherapy and didn't bother telling me, so the nurses had to tell me when I checked in at the cancer center for my next treatment. Totally unrelated to any current news, of course." Some users anticipated the Liberal commentariat's response to the shooting. I'm going to read a couple more posts here. We've got this one. "I have no patience for lib think pieces trying to humanize healthcare CEOs who let people die of cancer to afford their fourth yacht. You people are embarrassing." We've got another one from Ashley Ray. "Democrats need to move to the right. The most I have seen this country united in years is over the assassination of a healthcare CEO, so I don't know if that's true." But this next post showed an unusual breakout of solidarity between users of X. It starts with this tweet. It says, "All-time great ratio." They pulled the post down when it got to about 21,000 laughing emojis. And it is, I think, a Facebook post, and it's from United Health Group, saying how sad they are at the killing of their CEO. And at the bottom, you'll see that it had 19.3 thousand laughing emojis, 1.9 thousand crying emojis, and 1.6 thousand, hugging heart emojis. So as he said there, it got pulled down when it got to about 21,000. And then that tweet gets community noted with this. Readers added context they thought people might want to know. "The post has not been taken down, and as of 5th of December, has around 32,000 ha-ha reactions." Shouldn't laugh, really. Helena, we're not condoning murder here. We're not encouraging nothing. But these health insurance companies, probably, along with arms dealers, amongst the most vile corporations on earth. Is this apparent bubbling up of counter-CEO revolutionary spirit overdue?
Unfortunately, thoughts and prayers, I don't think they were covered in his plan, unfortunately. So he's SOL in that regard. But I think you're right that there is a really large outpouring of it's kind of grim mirth over the circumstances of this guy's death. Now, it's interesting that you brought up in the piece there the fact that the shells of the ammunition cartridges that you used, had "deny, defend, depose" written on them. Somebody on Twitter, I'm not calling it X, they said that this is eerily similar to a book that's written about the insurance sector called Delay, Deny, Defend, that specifically goes into detail into how the insurance sector tries to make sure that it doesn't have to pay out claims by going through all of the legal processes that it needs to ensure that it doesn't. And it seems to me very, very close in nature as the kind of things that are the sentiments we've seen expressed on social media as to the moral sewer that is the private healthcare industry, especially in America. There's one thing to be a private healthcare provider being forced to compete with universal healthcare, where literally if you don't offer something that is actually worth pursuing, then you don't have any business, right? So that actually forces the private sector to provide a product that's worth paying money for. Whereas in America, where there's basically no public option outside of like Medicare, which is just the government paying for your private healthcare anyway, there is no alternative. There is no alternative, and the private health companies know they have a monopoly, and they know that they can get away with this stuff. And people are absolutely furious about this, and as well they should be. It just shows you how much different the election could have been if the Democrats are running on Medicare for all, for example. But I digress. And it's also interesting that we need to talk about a concept called social murder, which is something that was thought of by Engels all these years ago, which is essentially the concept of the removal or the withholding of things necessary for life by people who have hoarded these things. For example, say a government deliberately restricting access to welfare for people who need it to survive, or indeed a private healthcare company creating a paywall behind the necessary things for life, such as healthcare, which of course is an inelastic market. You can't not pay for it, so you'll pay whatever it takes. And they know they have this strong position, and so they'll charge people through the teeth, or they'll deny coverage, and they'll make as much money as they can, specifically because that's what drives shareholder value, because they have no human interest. The negative externalities of human suffering is something that's not relative to them, or it's not relevant to them, because what's actually important is the one thing, which is their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And it's interesting, the tweet said about, well, the left versus the right in terms of how they perceive this issue. And we're seeing a lot, I think it's not just in this specific instance, but broadly across all of politics, across the left and the right, there's this broad anti-corporate politics. People hate corporations, whereas obviously the left have always hated corporations because, we're anti-capitalist and corporations are a capitalist entity. But the right wing that's now kind of supporting this popular capitalism, as Aaron Bastani calls it, that we see from like Reform UK, talking about like the small businesses versus like the big businesses, this idea of the World Economic Forum trying to take over all the small businesses in the world by owning everything. Broadly, everyone's noticing the upward funnel of wealth and of money and of resources into the pockets of the 1% and the corporations in this country. The question is, of course, who are the people with the solutions? And at the end of the day, it's going to be the left, because we're the ones who actually genuinely believe in anti-capitalist politics, whereas the right, they only posture at it when it's relevant to them.
There are plenty of reasons to hate United Healthcare in particular. I read this morning that they use an AI to determine whether or not a particular case is covered by the insurance that you've spent thousands of dollars on. And it's wrong 90% of the time. And what that means is that the AI makes this judgment, says, oh, I'm sorry, you have to take your own appendix out because we're not going to cover it. And then when it is taken to court to rule on that judgment, 90% of judges are like, no, actually, they should have had an operation and not done it on their kitchen table, actually. That's it from us tonight. Helena, thank you so much for joining us.
Really important show tonight. Thank you very much for having me on.
It was an important show, and I was really glad to have you here with me. Come back tomorrow for another live show from 6 p.m. Until then, I've been Stephen Methven, and you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.